They smiled at me like I was a harmless, poor old working man, then treated me worse than a servant in their own dining room. My son sat there and let it happen, because he wanted to belong to their bloodline. What would you do if you were me? Read to the end and tell me if you think I went too far. And if you have an opinion, share it, because I need to know if I am still thinking like a father or like a man who finally snapped. My name is Daniel Chambers. I'm 67 years old, a widower, a father, and a grandfather. I built my life with calloused hands and quiet discipline, and I raised my son Ethan the same way. I thought I understood pride. I did not understand cruelty until I met the family my daughter-in-law came from. Ethan met Vivian Ashford at a fundraiser in Boston. That alone should have warned me. Ethan worked in finance not because I pushed him into it, but because he was good at numbers and hated the uncertainty I lived with when I was young. He grew up watching me do overtime, watching me swallow stress so he would never have to taste it. When he called me and said, "Dad, I'm going to propose," I felt something inside me loosen, like maybe all the sacrifices had landed somewhere safe. Then he added carefully, "Her family is traditional." Traditional is a word people use when they mean controlling. A week later, Ethan told me Vivian wanted me to meet her parents at their home in Connecticut. Not a house, not a place. A home, the way people say it when the property has a name. Ashford House. I asked Ethan what her father did for a living. "He's on boards," Ethan said. That was my first hint that money was the least important thing in their world. I drove down in my old pickup because it still ran, and because I've never understood the kind of man who buys a new car to impress strangers. I wore a plain suit I'd had tailored 10 years ago for my daughter Megan's wedding. The cuffs were a little shiny from age, but it was clean. My watch was modest. My hands looked like what they were, hands that had worked. I did it on purpose. I wanted to see who they were when they thought I was nobody. Ashford House sat behind iron gates and stone walls like it was embarrassed by the rest of the country. A circular drive wrapped around a fountain. A man in a black jacket stepped toward my truck before I'd even killed the engine. He didn't smile. He looked at the truck like it had tracked mud onto a cathedral floor. "Deliveries go around back," he said. For a second I thought he was joking. Then I saw the tilt of his chin, the casual certainty. "I'm Daniel Chambers," I told him. "I'm here to see the Ashfords." He hesitated, then tapped an earpiece like I was a suspicious package. A moment later, he opened my door without asking and leaned inside as if he expected to find a mop. "Park along the gravel," he said, pointing toward a side lane lined with hedges. Not where the guest cars were, not where Ethan's car sat. Along the gravel, like I was supposed to be grateful for permission to exist. I did it anyway. I walked up the front steps alone. No one opened the door. I rang the bell and waited long enough to feel the humiliation settle into my shoulders. Finally, a woman opened it. She was in her 50s, hairpin tight, uniform crisp. Not a hostess, staff. She looked relieved to see me, like she'd been sent to deal with something unpleasant. "This way," she said, and led me through halls that smelled like lemon polish and old money. I could hear voices ahead, laughter, glasses clinking. Then we entered the sitting room. Vivian stood by the fireplace in a pale dress that made her look like she'd been painted into the room. Her father, Charles Ashford, was tall and silver-haired, wearing a casual jacket that probably cost more than my first year's wages. Her mother, Margaret Ashford, sat with her legs crossed like she had never bent her body to do anything difficult. Ethan stood beside Vivian, smiling too hard. For half a breath, relief warmed my chest. My boy looked healthy. He looked in love. Then Charles Ashford's eyes found me, slid over my suit, paused at my hands, and cooled. "So," he said, not standing, "this is Daniel. Not Mr. Chambers. Not Ethan's father. Like I was a tool Ethan had brought home." Vivian stepped forward and kissed my cheek. Her perfume was expensive and careful. "Daniel," she said as if we were equals. "You made it." Charles's gaze shifted behind me toward the staff woman, and he nodded once. "Take his coat," he said. I wasn't wearing a coat. The staff woman glanced at me confused. I gave her a small shake of my head, a quiet mercy. Margaret Ashford smiled with her lips only. "We weren't sure you'd find us." It was a subtle insult, like she assumed I couldn't navigate a map without a foreman pointing. I sat where Ethan gestured, on the edge of a sofa that felt like it had never held a body that weighed anything. Charles began speaking to Ethan as if I wasn't there. "Vivian tells me you're considering a move to New York," he said. Ethan nodded. "If the opportunity is right." Charles sipped his drink. "Ambition is respectable if it's directed properly." Then Margaret turned to me and asked, "And you, Daniel, what line of work were you in?" "Were," past tense, like I was already a ghost. "I worked electrical most of my life," I said. "Union, then independent." "Electrical," she repeated, tasting the word like it might stain her tongue. "Useful." Charles's mouth twitched. "Hands-on," he said. "A practical life." Vivian touched Ethan's arm. "Daniel's very grounded," she said. Grounded, like a dog that stays in the yard. The first real humiliation came at dinner. Not because of anything dramatic, not because they shouted. People like that rarely raise their voices. They don't need to. They have quieter weapons. The dining room was long and formal, lit by a chandelier that threw soft light over polished wood. There were place settings for 8. Only 6 people sat down. The others, I realized, were invisible staff. Ethan and Vivian were seated near Charles and Margaret. An older man I hadn't met, Vivian's uncle Harrison, took the head of the table. A young woman named Claire, Vivian's cousin, sat beside him. They were all dressed as if the meal was a performance. And then I saw where my place was. Not at the table. A small side chair near the wall, beside a narrow console table with extra plates. At first I thought it was a mistake, like staff had set an extra chair somewhere temporary. Then Margaret turned her head and said pleasantly, "Daniel, you can sit there. It's easier. The table is tight." Tight. There were 2 empty seats at the table. Ethan's face went pale. He opened his mouth, then closed it again when Vivian squeezed his hand under the linen. I felt something hot flash through me. Not anger yet. A different kind of pain. The kind that makes you see your own son as a stranger for half a second. I sat in the chair by the wall. I did it because I wanted to see how far they'd go. Harrison Ashford raised his glass. "To heritage," he said. They all echoed it like a prayer. Then the conversation moved around me as if I were furniture. They discussed private schools and summer homes and old families who still matter. Claire laughed about a man whose accent was too provincial to be trusted. Charles told a story about firing a chef because the chef's background didn't align with the house. And then, casually, like it was normal, Margaret addressed me without looking. "Daniel," she said, "could you do me a small favor?" I waited. "The pantry door has been sticking," she continued. "The staff keep complaining. You're good with your hands. Perhaps you can take a look after dinner." Ethan finally spoke. "Mom." Vivian cut him off with a soft laugh. "It's no trouble. Daniel likes feeling needed." Feeling needed. Like I was a spare wrench in a drawer. I smiled. And something inside me quietly wrote their names down, the way my mind always does when it decides a situation has become dangerous. Because that was the moment I understood this was not about class. This was about domination. After dinner, the staff woman, her name tag said Rosa, appeared to clear plates. She avoided my eyes, but her hands shook slightly. Margaret pointed at me with her fork. "Daniel will handle the pantry," she said, like she was assigning chores. Rosa froze. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it, Rosa murmured. "Please don't." I looked at her. Her eyes flicked toward the ceiling corners where small black domes sat half-hidden in molding. Cameras. Then she glanced toward the hall, where Charles Ashford stood speaking to Ethan in a low voice, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder like a proprietary brand. Rosa swallowed and whispered, "They like to have stories." Stories. Recorded. Used later. I walked to the pantry door anyway, because refusing would have fed them. The door wasn't sticking. The hinge pin had been removed. Someone had loosened it so the door would sag and scrape. A trap designed to make me struggle. I knelt, adjusted it with 2 fingers, and stood. Easy, quiet, no performance. When I turned back, Margaret was watching with a faint disappointment, like she'd wanted me to sweat. "Very good," she said. "See? Useful." That night I stayed in the guest room they assigned me. Not one of the beautiful rooms upstairs. A smaller one in a back wing, far from the sound of the house. Far from the family. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle. I kept thinking about Ethan's face when he saw my chair by the wall. He didn't look proud. He looked afraid. In the morning, Vivian found me alone in the kitchen, making coffee from a machine that cost more than my first truck. She leaned against the counter and watched me like I was an experiment. "You didn't say much last night," she said. "I listened," I answered. She smiled. "My family can be intense." That was another word people use when they mean cruel. "Ethan loves you," I said. Vivian's smile held. "Ethan is devoted. That's why he'll do well." "Do well where?" I asked. "In our world," she said, as if it was a kingdom. Then she tilted her head. "Tell me something, Daniel. What did you do with your retirement?" There it was. Not curiosity. Reconnaissance. I gave her what she expected. A small shrug. A working man's humility. "I get by," I said. "Not much left after raising kids." Vivian's eyes softened. Not with kindness, but with satisfaction. "And your house?" she asked. "It's paid off," I said. "Just the one?" she pressed. I looked at her and smiled gently, like I didn't understand the game. "Just the one," I lied. Vivian took a sip of her tea and said, almost casually, "My father has an idea. Something that could help Ethan build the right foundation." Foundation. Another word that, in their mouths, meant control. Later that afternoon, Charles invited Ethan and me into his study. It was the kind of room designed to make people feel small. Dark wood, heavy curtains, oil portraits of men who stared down like judges. Charles poured bourbon for Ethan, not for me. Then he began. "Ethan is joining our family," Charles said. "And families protect their own. We have structures for that." He slid a folder across the desk toward me. Inside were papers with expensive letterhead and empty signature lines. A trust structure. A family preservation vehicle. A polite way of saying, "Give us access to what you own, so we can decide what your son deserves." Ethan looked at me with a forced smile. "Dad, it's just planning." Charles leaned back. "Daniel, you've lived a practical life. You must understand the value of joining something bigger than yourself." I flipped through the pages slowly. Then I saw a clause that made my stomach tighten. In the event of incapacity, the trustees could assume decision-making authority over the grantor's assets. The trustees were Charles and Margaret Ashford, meaning if I signed, and then anything happened to me, they could take control. Not only for Ethan, for family. And I was not family to them. I was a wallet with legs. I closed the folder and slid it back. "I don't sign things I don't understand," I said. Charles's expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened. "It's standard," he said. "Then your lawyer can explain it," I answered. Vivian's voice drifted from the doorway. "Daniel, you're being difficult." Difficult. The word people use when you refuse to be used. Ethan's jaw clenched. "Dad, please, don't embarrass me." There it was, the real infection. My son had started measuring his dignity by their approval. I stood and said quietly, "I won't be signing today." Charles watched me like a man considering whether to crush an insect or flick it away. "You're free to do as you wish," he said. "But understand something, Daniel. Ethan's future is not a small thing. Don't poison it with stubborn pride." I left the study without another word. I drove home that evening with my hands tight on the wheel, feeling a cold clarity settle in. I had believed for years that family meant patience and sacrifice, even when you were treated like an inconvenience. I had lived that way. At home, my daughter Megan called to ask if I wanted to come by and see my grandson Caleb's school project. Caleb was 9, all elbows and energy, the kind of kid who still believed adults were good by default. I went to Megan's house first instead of mine. When Caleb ran into my arms and squeezed me, I felt my throat tighten. And I realized something that made the anger in me turn into something sharper. If the Ashfords got their claws into my life, they wouldn't just destroy me. They'd use Caleb as collateral. A week later, Ethan called. His voice was strained. "Dad," he said, "Vivian's parents want to host an engagement dinner. Bigger. More people. It matters." "It matters to who?" I asked. Silence. Then Ethan said, "They want you there early, to help." Help! I could hear it now. The way they'd frame humiliation as family participation. I could have refused. I should have. But something in me needed to know exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. Needed evidence, not instinct. So I said, "I'll be there." The engagement dinner was held at a private club on the coast. Marble floors, a string quartet, men in suits that fit like armor. I arrived early as instructed. A staff member handed me a folded black jacket and said without apology, "Valet line is outside. They said you'd know what to do." They had decided I was staff. I walked outside and stood in the sea wind watching expensive cars glide up like ships docking. And then I did something that would later define everything that happened. I put the jacket on. I took keys from strangers. I parked their cars. Not because I had to, because I wanted them to think I was harmless enough to ignore. And while I parked cars, I listened. Rich people talk freely when they think the help is deaf. I heard Charles Ashford tell a man named Richard Latimer, "Ethan's father is exactly what we expected. Simple, sturdy, no imagination." I heard Margaret say, laughing, "Vivian says he owns one little house. Can you imagine?" Then Harrison Ashford's voice, amused. "All that work and nothing to show for it." And then the part that made my blood go cold. "He's stubborn," Charles said. "But stubborn men break. We'll apply pressure. Vivian knows how to handle Ethan." Pressure, meaning turn my own son into a lever. I kept parking cars. I smiled at every insult I overheard because anger would have tipped them off. Inside, when the guests gathered, they finally acknowledged me, not with welcome, with performance. Charles stepped to a microphone to toast the couple. The room quieted. He praised Ethan as promising. He praised Vivian as pure Ashford. He praised the joining of bloodlines. Then he said, clearly with a faint smile, "And of course we're grateful to Daniel Chambers, who has provided Ethan with a humble origin story." Laughter, soft and polite, rippled through the room. Humble origin story. Like my life was a cute tale they could tell at parties. Ethan laughed too, a thin sound that broke something in me. After the toast, Margaret approached with a glass of champagne and handed it to me like she was rewarding a dog for sitting. "I hope you're enjoying yourself," she said. "I'm learning," I answered. She blinked. "Learning?" "How your family treats people," I said. Her smile sharpened. "People should know their place." Then lightly she added, Vivian will be good for Ethan. She will elevate him. Elevate. As if Ethan was something low that needed lifting. Later, I found Ethan alone near a balcony, staring out at the dark water. "Son," I said. He flinched like he expected a blow. "Dad," he said quickly, "please don't start." I kept my voice steady. "Do you think what they did tonight was right?" Ethan swallowed. "They're old world. It's not personal." "Everything is personal when it's your father," I said. Ethan's eyes glistened, just for a moment, before pride snapped back into place. "You don't get it," he whispered. "They have history. Real history." I leaned closer. "And I have you." Ethan looked away. "Vivian's pregnant." The words landed like a stone. My first thought was joy. My second was fear, because now I understood the trap. A baby meant leverage. A baby meant they could tighten the net. I forced my face into a smile. That's good news." Ethan nodded, but his face looked sick. "They want us to move into Ashford House for a while," he said. "Just until the baby comes." I stared at him. "They want us under their roof," he added quickly, like he was repeating a script. "It's tradition." I heard Charles's voice in my mind. Pressure. I drove home that night and I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened a locked drawer in my desk and pulled out a phone I kept turned off. A number I hadn't called since the last time my life required shadows. I called my old friend Mason Price. When Mason answered, his voice was sharp. "Daniel?" "I need eyes," I said. "Quiet ones." Mason didn't ask questions. He never did. He just said, "Give me names." I gave him the Ashfords, and then I made the second decision that would define what happened next. I decided the Ashfords would never touch my family again, even if the way I stopped them wasn't legal. Weeks passed. Vivian's pregnancy became the center of everything. Ethan moved like a man underwater, smiling for pictures, speaking the right lines. I was invited to Ashford House again for family bonding. What that meant was more humiliations. Margaret asked me to carry boxes since you're strong. Harrison asked me to fetch him a drink, like you do at the club. Claire called me Mr. Chambers in front of guests, then Daniel in private, like switching names changed my status. At one point, Vivian's mother handed me a napkin and said, "Wipe that, you dripped." I looked down. There was no drip. She had wanted to see if I would obey. I wiped anyway, slowly, like I didn't mind. And while they played their games, I watched their house. I watched where they kept keys. I watched who came and went. I listened to how staff moved when Charles's voice rose. I noticed which doors were always locked. The library, the wine room, the old stone outbuilding behind the hedge, where security cameras pointed away. Mason called me one night and said, "They aren't aristocrats, not the way they claim." I sat in my kitchen, lights low, and listened. "The title they use," Mason said, "it's tied to an old European house that went dormant decades ago. The Ashfords bought the rights through intermediaries. They've been selling access, membership, heritage experiences. It's a brand." A brand, a costume. Mason continued. "And there's more. They move money through charities. The same charity events where they meet men like your son." My jaw tightened. "They're not just snobs," Mason added. "They're predators." I felt my hands go cold. "How sure are you?" I asked. Mason's voice hardened. "I have copies of documents that should not exist. And Daniel, they know you're in the way." That night, I received a text from an unknown number. "Don't eat anything at Ashford House tomorrow. Don't drink anything. They're angry." My lungs tightened. I typed back, "Who is this?" A moment later, "Rosa, please. They say accidents happen to stubborn men." That was when the situation stopped being about humiliation. and became about survival. Second hook. I thought the worst thing the Ashfords could do was shame me. Then I learned they were planning to remove me, like you remove a loose nail. If I died suddenly, Ethan would be isolated, grieving, and fully inside their control. And they were confident no one would question it, because to them, men like me were disposable. The next day, I went to Ashford House anyway. I arrived carrying a gift bag, smiling like a naive father. Inside the bag was nothing important. The important thing was in my coat, under the lining, a small camera Mason had given me, the kind that didn't look like a camera. I am not going to describe how it worked. I am only going to tell you that placing it where I placed it was illegal, and I knew it. I also knew I didn't have another choice. Rosa met my eyes as I entered. Her face was tight with fear. She nodded once, barely noticeable, and moved toward the hall. I followed her at a distance, pretending to admire the portraits. In the kitchen corridor, she whispered, "They're having a hunting weekend. They want you to come. They told Mr. Ethan you should. They said it will make you bond." Hunting weekend. Remote location. Guns. Accidents. I asked quietly, "Did they say anything else?" Rosa's voice shook. Mr. Charles said, "If he falls, he falls." I felt something inside me settle into iron. I left Ashford House an hour later, smiling, refusing food, claiming my stomach was sensitive. Margaret watched me go with narrowed eyes. Then she said lightly, "Next time, try not to be so delicate." Delicate, as if caution was weakness. That night I sat at my desk and watched the footage I'd captured. Not of humiliation, not of dinner talk, of Charles and Harrison in the library, speaking in low voices. They were discussing my stubbornness. They were discussing forcing Ethan's hand. They were discussing how Vivian needed to get Ethan to convince me to sign the trust papers because the old man won't last forever. And then Charles said calmly, "If he won't sign, we'll make sure he can't refuse." Harrison laughed. "Accidents happen." That was enough. I could have gone to the police with that. I could have tried to make it legal. But here is the truth. Men like Charles Ashford don't fear the law. They fear exposure, ruin, loss of status. So I decided to hit them where it actually hurt. And I decided to do it in a way that would not be clean. The Ashfords had a gala coming up, their biggest charity event of the year, the Heritage Foundation Winter Ball. Vivian told Ethan it was mandatory. She told him the right donors would be there, the right families. She told him their baby deserved to be born into respect. They invited me too, not because they wanted me there, because they wanted me to play my role, the humble origin story, the servant. I accepted. In the days before the gala, Mason sent me a message. The original house that holds the title is willing to speak. They are furious. The Ashfords forged genealogy. Forged, meaning their entire identity was a lie. And then Mason sent one more line that made my skin prickle. They keep the forged lineage documents in a safe in the library. A safe. Behind cameras, behind locks. The kind of barrier meant to stop honest men. I am not an honest man when my family is threatened. 2 nights before the gala, I went back to Ashford House, not as myself. I wore a plain cap, a work jacket, and carried a toolbox. I walked through a service entrance Rosa had told me about, because she didn't want a man to die in her employer's accident. What happened next was trespass. What happened next was theft. I will not dress it up. I got into the library when the house slept. I opened the safe, and I took what I needed. Not money, not jewelry, paper, proof. I replaced the documents with something else. Clean copies, printed to look real, but subtly wrong, the way a skilled liar knows how to bait another liar. Then I left. I drove home with my heart pounding like a drum, knowing that if I was caught, my life would end in handcuffs and shame. And yet I felt calmer than I had in months, because now the Ashfords didn't own the story. I did. The night of the gala arrived. I showed up in my old suit again, the one with the slightly shiny cuffs. I let them see me as small. Margaret greeted me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Daniel," she said, "we've arranged something for you." A staff member handed me the same black valet jacket. Margaret's voice was sweet. "You'll be more comfortable being useful." Ethan stood nearby, jaw clenched, eyes tired. Vivian stood beside him, a hand on her belly, looking like royalty about to be crowned. I took the jacket. I put it on, and then I walked into the ballroom. The room was packed with the kind of people who laugh softly and judge loudly, the kind of people the Ashfords depended on. Photographers were there, reporters, donors. Charles stepped onto the stage to begin the speech. Behind him, a huge screen displayed the charity logo. He began praising heritage. He began praising duty. He began telling the audience how the Ashfords had preserved culture for generations. Then he gestured toward Ethan and Vivian. "And now," Charles said, "we welcome new blood into our line." The word blood made my stomach twist. As applause rose, I walked quietly to the side of the stage where a technician sat near the control system. Mason had handled that part. Money changes hands easily at events like this. A new technician badge. A quiet substitution. Illegal. Effective. When Charles reached the line where he would introduce me as the humble origin story, the screen behind him went black. The music cut. A hush rippled through the room. Charles frowned and turned slightly, and then the screen lit up again. Not with the charity logo, with footage from the Ashford Library. Charles's own face lit by lamplight speaking in that calm, poisonous tone. "If he won't sign," Charles's recorded voice said, "we'll make sure he can't refuse." Gasps spread like fire. Harrison's laugh followed in the recording. "Accidents happen." Charles froze on stage like his spine had turned to ice. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping. Vivian's face went stark white. Ethan turned toward the screen, his mouth opening in disbelief. The video continued. Clips of Margaret calling staff invisible. Clips of Claire mocking guests as common. Clips of Vivian asking about my assets, smiling when she thought I was broke. Then, the final clip. Charles holding the trust folder saying, "He's stubborn, but stubborn men break." The room erupted, not in shouting, in something worse. Whispers, phones coming out, people leaning away like the Ashfords carried disease. Charles stepped away from the microphone, his hands trembling. "This is," he began. But no one was listening, because at the same time in the front row an elderly man stood up, a man with a sharp posture and a face like carved stone. He spoke loud enough to slice the room. "My family holds the legitimate title you have been wearing like stolen clothing," he said. "You are not what you claim." The man turned slightly toward a cluster of reporters. "I have been asked for comment," he continued. "My comment is simple. They are frauds." Charles's face crumpled, not with sadness, with terror. Because in their world, once the mask is ripped off, there is no forgiveness, only distance. Margaret tried to move toward the stage, but people stepped back from her like she was contagious. Vivian clutched her belly, swaying. Ethan stared at her, then at his father, then back at her. And in his eyes, I finally saw something I hadn't seen in months. Clarity. Vivian whispered, "Ethan, don't." Ethan took a step away from her. Charles found his voice again, sharp now. "Who did this?" His gaze scanned the room, frantic, hunting for a target. It landed on me, on the valet jacket, on the man he thought was beneath him. His eyes widened as he realized the truth. The help had been listening. I met his gaze and smiled politely, the same polite smile I'd worn through every insult. Charles started toward me, but Harrison grabbed his arm, hissing something urgent. Not because Harrison cared, but because Charles making a scene would confirm everything on that screen. Vivian's cousin Claire began crying, loudly, as if tears could wash away proof. Margaret's lips moved soundlessly. Then, from the side of the ballroom, two uniformed men entered. Not police, private security, hired by the club, responding to the chaos. Behind them were two men in suits with badges. Someone had called. Someone had shared documents. Anonymous documents, delivered to the right hands at the right time, containing evidence of charity fraud and financial laundering that even the Ashfords couldn't talk their way out of. Charles's knees buckled slightly. I watched Ethan's face as he absorbed it all. I watched him turn to Vivian and say quietly, "You used me." Vivian's voice broke. "I loved you." Ethan's laugh was hollow. "You loved what I could be." He looked at me then, and his eyes filled. "Dad," he whispered, "I didn't know." I wanted to embrace him. I wanted to scream at him. Instead, I said the only thing that mattered. "Come home." Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at Vivian's belly. He looked at Charles, who was now being questioned by the men with badges. He looked at the room full of people who were turning away, already rewriting the story so they wouldn't be associated with disgrace. Then Ethan stepped toward me. Vivian reached for him. Ethan pulled away. And in that moment, the Ashfords lost what they wanted most: control of my son. The weeks after the gala were ugly. Ethan moved out of Ashford House. He came to my home with a suitcase and a face that looked 10 years older. He sat at my kitchen table, stared at his hands, and whispered, "I thought if I endured it, I'd earn them." I told him, "You don't earn love by being smaller." Vivian called him constantly, sometimes crying, sometimes cold, sometimes threatening. Charles tried to contact me once. He left a voicemail. His voice was controlled, but underneath it was rage. "You have destroyed a family," he said. I listened to it twice, then deleted it. The authorities did what authorities do when rich people finally lose their shield. They moved slowly, but they moved. Boards accepted resignations. Donations were paused. Friends disappeared. Ashford House went quiet. And then Rosa called me. Her voice shook as she said, "They fired staff. They're selling things. They're blaming you." I told her, "I'm sorry." She was silent a moment, then whispered, "No, thank you." Ethan's baby girl was born in early spring. Her name is Lily. When I held her, tiny and warm, I felt a fierce grief for the father Ethan had almost become, a man owned by other people's pride. Vivian fought Ethan in private ways, social ways, the kind of warfare wealthy families are trained for. She tried to isolate him again, but this time, Ethan had seen behind the curtain. He didn't go back. And as for me, I slept poorly for months, not from guilt about humiliating the Ashfords, not from pity, from the knowledge that my revenge had crossed lines. I trespassed. I stole. I used illegal surveillance. I broke the rules because the rules were not built to protect men like me from families like them. If the law ever comes for me, I will not pretend I'm innocent. I will only say I chose my son and my granddaughter over a clean conscience. Sometimes at night I still hear Charles Ashford's voice from that recording. Stubborn men break. He was wrong. I did not break. I bent quietly until the right moment, and then I snapped back hard enough to shatter the people who thought they could step on me. So tell me, was I right to do it the way I did? Or did I become something I used to hate just to make sure my family survived?
My grandpa's words really happened. I believe him. If you want more true tales like this, hit subscribe.